Hi.
Welcome. Hi.
Thank you.
Let me do your intro. So we are very excited. Our second speaker is Nic Tringali, who is a game designer at Bithell Games, the Lunar Division label. They are most known for the Banished Vault, John Wick Hex, and Sundogs, and have a particular interest in science fiction, tabletop, and analog designs, and the rich interaction between players and game systems. I'm very excited to have you at Earthquake Celebration, Nic, because man, a lot of people were very happy with Banished Vault.
That's great. Yeah, I'm glad they were not very mad at the game then.
Yeah, that's what you want. So
Yeah,
go ahead and take it away.
thank you. Yeah, I'm Nick. I have been in the industry for I don't know, 8 to 10 years or something. I've worked on I think about 9 games in that time. And the Banished Vault we released this year is a game about procedurally exploring procedurally generated solar systems, doing resource management, time management. You have a crew of exiles. You're taking them around to planets and so on. You roll some dice. You try and get out before your time is up. And what I want to talk about today is the exploration design, how the player kind of explores the game. A lot of this is not something we set out from the beginning necessarily, and a lot. Just some lessons that we kind of learned like after the game was out and watching people play. So there's a little bit of like our goals from the beginning, and then some just kind of like figuring things out and seeing how people interact with the game afterwards. And that is not working, so I'll have to do. Great. So first, I just want to go through a couple of screenshots of the game and kind of set up the sort of loop or the general pattern that the players go under. So you first arrive in a solar system with your vault, which is a Gothic monastery that's a generation ship, and you are kind of on the run, traveling from solar system to solar system. The vault carries everything that the player has, so their characters, which are exiles, the resources, your ships, and all that. You then are presented with the map of the game, which is a kind of tree structure of the solar system. This is essentially what's called a delta V map, and what it does is heavily abstract the solar system, right? So as opposed to kind of seeing, orbiting bodies floating around the sun, you see everything in terms of energy to go from one stable orbit to another stable orbit, right? So you can see all the little kind of nodes and locations on the solar system in between the planets and moons and so on have an energy cost to travel in between. And as opposed to thinking through travel as like this kind of continuous problem of distance and timing and so on, the player just has one number or maybe two numbers, right, of like energy or thrust. And then once the player arrives at a planet, you are presented with the grid, and the grid has resources and a kind of terrain that the player will then gather resources from. You construct buildings on, and eventually, create fuel and stasis and the things you need to survive the solar system and then complete the run of the game itself. And there are some also secondary objectives like the artifacts or just more long-term plans as opposed to just your survival. And then lastly, the player encounters a lot of randomness and a lot of uncertainty in the game. Probably the most visible one to the player are the dice rolls that represent the hazards. So moving between two certain locations in the solar system will be hazardous. So you have to roll some dice, or maybe constructing buildings over a certain space on the grid will require you to roll some dice. And the dice rolls essentially just cost the player an additional resource that is unknown, right? So it might be your exile's faith, or they might lose actions, or you get penalized in losing some other resources that you're carrying with you. But it just kind of resolves down to you suffer an additional penalty if you can't succeed in the dice roll. So from the beginning, we had some kind of emotional goals that we wanted to set out for the player to experience. The first one being size. So the game is somewhat abstract in its kind of presentation, but we wanted to emphasize to the player, these planets are very big, space is very huge, it takes a long time to travel from one to another. we want the game to be hostile to the player in a certain sense, and just have the kind of emotion of hostility of traveling in outer space, right? And then unpredictability is just a general, concept of roguelikes and run-based games. And then ultimately, all three of those kind of are wrapped up and given to the player, and then we want the player to overcome those three, right? Because those are kind of imposing onto their experience, and then if they can overcome it, that is the kind of positive emotion we want the player to have. The size is important because the player needs to feel isolated, and it should feel difficult and large and vast, as opposed to what the visual presentation of the game is quite abstract. You can zoom out and see most of a solar system in one kind of view on screen, right? And so the size is brought back in with how the player understands the resources and how they understand movement throughout the solar system. So the abstraction of the numbers starts to say, okay, well, if this, going from orbit to the surface of this planet is only 5 energy, that might only cost a little bit of fuel. But if you then see another planet and it takes 10 energy to land, right, that fuel should or sorry, the fuel cost might be 3 times as much as opposed to just double, right? And so the size becomes an important factor in how all the values of the resources play together, to counteract essentially the abstract of the map. The hostility theme is tricky because it does not really work for everyone, and it is not necessarily like a positive or interesting thing inherently. But it was something that we realized was sort of coming into the game given some other elements that I'll go into. But once we realized that was kind of a factor in what the game was doing, we sort of leaned into it, right? So the theme then became this more gothic, harsh, and austere kind of presentation and aesthetic. But as well, from a design point of view, the hostility is brought in how mistakes are punished, or how the player's mistakes are punished, right? Which are very quickly and usually quite sharp, with a lot of impacts throughout the overall player's state and how they'll achieve their goals. And the unpredictability is actually kind of what the rest of this talk will be about, because exploration is very much about like resolving an unpredictable or uncertain situation. So that's essentially what I'm going to be going into further. And with the starting points on the design more specifically, from the beginning of the game, we had a few sort of key elements to bring in. The first was starting with realistic math. So the image on screen is the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, which is essentially just kind of like if you have a craft and you eject a mass from the craft, you will gain energy related to how the mass is, and so on. And essentially, we want the player to know that beneath the hood, right, there is a almost very realistic math going on, so that they can understand how the size of the solar systems are generated, right? It is not necessarily, oh, I can just spend an easy amount of fuel to get everywhere where I want to go. Once the player knows that, right, the fuel I'm bringing onto the ship, or how the ship's mass relates to the energy that they can create with the fuel and engine that they have, they can start to understand that, oh, this planet that is maybe only a few steps away from the planet I'm on, but it takes twice as much energy to get there, which means it'll take 4 times as much fuel, begins to kind of impress upon the player how far away everything actually is. The second design starting element was the idea of physically located resources. So in a typical kind of colony game or city building game or whatever, the player gathers a resource and it's either immediately kind of whisked away into a ether where they can get it later when they need to, or an agent kind of like takes that resource, puts it in a warehouse, and then later when the player wants to access it, the agent will take it back and take it where they want to go. And the player might notice like an inefficiency there or whatever, but it's a little bit more obfuscated. For the Banished Vault, I wanted to, from the beginning, say, no, when you gather a resource on a planet, it's on that planet. If you want to take it somewhere else, you need a ship, you need fuel, you need an engine, you need a navigator, and you need to figure out how much that's all going to cost to then bring that resource somewhere else to do whatever it is with it. This kind of imposition on the player is how the hostility theme kind of came about, right? Because very quickly you would start, doing things and you would realize like, oh, I need to go somewhere else with this water I just gathered. I didn't bring enough fuel to do that because I'm still learning the game or whatever. And that's quite a difficult thing for the players to, as you're learning the game, to sort of unpack and gather. And this also relates to the size theme as well, right? You can see when you're looking at a map, oh, there's water here, but iron there. And it sort of pulls everything apart, or sorry, spreads everything apart in a sense, for the players' goals and understandings on how they will get to what they want to do. And then the last kind of much more vague design element that I was thinking about in the beginning was the idea of like believability, right? Or just kind of like space exploration being believable. This was a little bit before the Gothic theme came in, but it sort of persisted throughout. And where this started was a thought I had about space exploration now, right? Humans exploring space with probes or whatever, and this idea that we know quite a bit about the places in our solar system or even in our galaxy, right? We can take spectrographic analysis of planets and moons and say, oh, there is iron on Mars or water on wherever. Io has volcanoes and so on. We have so much information, but it is so distant. And then when we finally arrive there, obviously things are not as we knew. They're not exactly what we knew, and there's so much in the process of getting there that becomes this kind of unexpected or uncertain journey, but with this kind of relatively known goal in a sense. And this to me contrasted with like terrestrial exploration, right? Which is, you're in a desert wandering around and then you crest a dune and you see an oasis. You might know, oh, right, there might be an oasis in a dune, but I don't know where it is, right? There's a kind of a weird inversion there that I thought was interesting and wanted to play with. Okay, so to kind of switch perspectives to the player's point of view, the player has goals, right? So they arrive in a solar system and they have a set of things they want to do. The first is they need resources. There's a set of basic resources that you can gather from planets, and there's some slightly more important ones or ones that are slightly more vital for your immediate survival, right? Iron, water, titanium to make stasis. Then the player starts examining, they look for space to build buildings. So constructing a building lets you gather resources and convert them into making fuel or stasis or whatever, right? And building space is a very limited, kind of resource that the player has because you can't move or destroy a building once it's constructed, right? So there's some figuring out the player has to know on, where am I going to build some buildings on which planets, how much space do I actually have, and so on. And then after that, the player will start examining secondary objectives, right? So getting artifacts, which convert to knowledge to unlock abilities or building other buildings or blueprints and ships and so on. And then some other resources that are more long-term style. So to, create faith, which is a sort of resource that ticks down on every exile over the course of the game or the run. And then altogether, the player is thinking about optimization in a kind of vague sense, right? So these values and every element creates a sort of abstract terrain in the player's mind, right? They can see where all their resources are. They can understand, oh, where's my action economy going to be best utilized, and then the player will start assembling the shortest route to complete as many goals as they can, right? That is the optimization through this terrain. They want to do as many things as possible while spending as few resources as they can. And so then the exploration starts to essentially say, how does the player convert the amount of unknown information in the solar system to known information to then complete those goals? And so we'll start by examining, well, what does the player know when they arrive in a solar system? What they know is where actually all the resources are. So right from the start, you can see exactly where everything is, right? There's no secret or hidden resources. There's no surprise resources. Everything is shown to you clearly on the map. The player has a good idea of which resources they need to complete their goals, right? So the the game's manual clearly says you need this much of anything to build this building, right? The player can also pretty clearly or specifically say how much fuel it will take to get to any specific place in the solar system, right? There's no way like, oh, you might accidentally spend more fuel in a unless you make a mistake, I suppose, right? And then lastly, the cost to actually get those resources, right? The kind of input of fuel and time and whatever is mostly known because of hazards, and so that will then start to transition to what do the players not know about the environment that they're in. So the exact cost of travel is a bit unknown because of the hazard result, right? So you can say, okay, it'll take me this much fuel and I can bring this many things with me when I arrive at this planet, but I'll have to cross a hazard, which will roll some dice, and that hazard may impose another penalty on me in actions or, faith or whatever, right? Then they don't know what the grid on the location has for them, right? So the grid space is semi-randomized and how it'll fit buildings and how large it is. And additionally, resources can actually be mutually exclusive, right? So if you look in the background of the grid on this slide here, on the kind of center right, there's a titanium resource and an iron resource. But every harvester is a 2 by 2 building and can't be moved or deleted. So constructing either a titanium harvester or an iron harvester would preclude the player from constructing the other one. So while every potential resource is shown to the player on the map view, when you arrive at a planet, it might actually resolve into only a subset of those. And then finally, the exact costs of then accessing those resources specifically, right? Switches or hazards again. And then as well as concept of depth. So a resource like that titanium resource can be at a depth of, 1, 2, or 3, which requires the player to construct a excavator building, which has a cost in resources and a cost in grid space as well, because it's in itself is a building. Altogether, this creates a model that the exploration operates under, which is the player knows what they will get, but not at what cost. So the outcome is pretty set in their goals, right? Resources, actions, the kind of economy of all those things. But the unknown cost starts to affect what the player does with how they start to attack those goals, right? Which is, what do you bring on your ships to construct your buildings? Do you want to bring in, extra spare resources to account for variability and so on? And what this does in kind of totality for the player is create a big front-loaded kind of overhead of planning. So planning is essentially the entire exploration of the game, right? Which is what the player does before they do anything. So firstly, planning is the player trying to search for an optimal route through the kind of abstract terrain, right? So they have this big, multivariable problem in front of them, and they're trying to unpack it and figure out what they want to do with it. The game and as by extension, me as the designer, are trying to destabilize the player from doing those things, right? I don't want there to be one clear path to their goal. I would always want there to be options or two difficult, routes or trade-offs or whatever. Secondly, the planning is managing the risk of unknown costs, and that risk almost becomes a sort of like meta resource that the player starts grappling, which can be extra resources to construct the excavator buildings that you might need, or if you lose resources during a hazard, you might consider Risk as a exile, which another character to bring on your ship in case you roll hazard poorly and they lose faith and they can't navigate, and so that has all these knock-on effects. So you might bring in spare people, which are also more actions and so on. So the Risk sort of becomes this broader category that the player will start thinking about. The planning starts to then become the player charting an ordered path through chaotic but known information, right? So there is a set amount of information in a sense, but it is so broad and so chaotic that you can't fully grapple with it, and you have to figure out what you want to do. This is only true because the game tells you where your goals are, and the player, in a sense, does not necessarily explore by getting new information about their goals. The player explores by determining what route they want to take through this chaos, right? And if the reverse was true about the information being hidden, the game would just be too hard. And the amount of time the player has to spend to kind of get to those goals and the physicality of the resources becomes unfair, and from the player's point of view starts to feel way too much like output randomness, even though it's not. And then so lastly, the second to last, the planning is essentially the player creating a system to unravel the game, and from my point of view, hopefully a flawed system. I don't want the player to perfectly succeed at their goals, right? I want there to always be some kind of uncertainty, and in a sense, the truest uncertainty of the game and the exploration is the player's doubt in thinking through every possibility to make that perfect plan to unravel the game. And then secondly, that once they do enact this plan, they then won't make a mistake in executing upon it. And so at the end of the day, the planning is then, that feeling and that emotion of overcoming the game in the elements of the size and hostility and unpredictability. When the player arrives in a solar system, they might spend 10, 20, 30 minutes just looking at the map and not making any moves and turning over all of the information that the game just kind of dumps upon them for the solar system and figuring out all of the different paths and all of the methods that they could take to achieve their goals. And then lastly, just as a small coda, this sort of planning path through the chaos reinforces the game's aesthetic theme and presentation, right? So the theme is the player is on a failed colony mission that is then on the run throughout the galaxy, and then broadly that the universe is knowable in the abstract but impossible to predict in the details. And that's it. Thank you very much. The game is available on Steam, and you can find me on co-host and Blue Sky on Twitter.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nick. That was fantastic. A lot of people are loving the art. Some people who hadn't seen the game before that were like, oh my god, I need to check out this game. And we have a little bit of time for questions, so feel free to keep adding questions to the board, folks. But one right away from Dr. Game. Did you play spaceport games like High Frontier before or while designing the game? And if so, did any of those influence your thought process?
Yes, so I played Leaving Earth and High Frontier before. I played them before starting working on the game. Both had a pretty... I wouldn't say like strong influence, but like both those games abstract space exploration in like a very fascinating way. But because they are board games and the kind of expectation on the player's time, they have a few different like rules and mechanical considerations that I couldn't quite bring over. The one I realized is like, you might be playing High Frontier, which is a very mathematical, very detailed game, and you might spend, an hour of physical real time planning, like, I'm going to go to Saturn and back, and that is going to be like a quarter of my game time, right? And for the Banished Vault, we were like, well, no, you should go from one planet to another in like 2 minutes or whatever, right? So once it was like, okay, what are these things doing? Well, I don't want to then make the player spend hours planning a journey. But yeah, both games are fascinating in how they abstract and very closely mimic actual space travel.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think is some of that difference of why is it okay in a board game context where people don't mind it taking an hour to plan a trip to Saturn, but in a video game context, maybe less so?
I wish I knew. This is something we talk about, or I've talked about with other designers or at work or whatever, is like, why do I not mind even spending like 5 minutes playing a quick card game in real life? But if you told me, oh, this is a 5 minute digital card game, it feels, like a materially different use of time. No, I don't know. I'll let you know if I answer that.
Yeah, another roguelike topic.
Yes. Why do we want to waste our time more in person than we do
Yeah,
on a
what is it
computer?
about physicality? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's another interesting question from Claire Metcalf, 2026. What did the design process look like? Do you start with the premise and that you described before creating the game, or did it kind of go the other way and you had kind of the game idea and then built a premise out of it?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by premise specifically, but the starting
Mm.
point was let's explore procedurally generated solar systems, and each solar system will be presented in this kind of delta V map. That was like the start. And so a couple weeks after we decided to do it, we had the like math model and moving around, and then it was, okay, is it interesting to figure out the kind of puzzle of get from one place to another using as little fuel as possible. From there, it was a lot of giving the player context to what they're doing and goals with survival and so on. That was a sort of starting point, I suppose. And then the theme of the kind of Gothic monastery came in later.
Okay, so kind of that route of wanting to do stuff with the deltas and wanting to kind of have that space exploration. That's kind
Yeah,
of the initial core.
yeah, exactly. And just trying to solve that like efficiency puzzle in a sense was the very beginning of it.
Right. Interesting. Here's a good question that I suspect is maybe a hard question from Tristvar. Is there a specific way you tune the information given to the player to make it feel challenging but overcomable enough?
I don't know if there's a specific way. The interesting thing about creating a game that is hard is you have a little bit of wiggle room on the high end, but not so much, right? At the beginning, I actually initially thought like, okay, well, what I'll do is define all the physical characteristics of every planet, and then the numbers will sprout out of that. And then basically the arc of that idea is slowly not doing that over the course of the whole production and just saying, nope, the moon is 3 energy to land, and that's, or 3 plus or minus 1 or whatever, right? So the tuning is interesting. I don't think I have a like definitive answer for you besides a lot of testing and a lot of it. I mean, it took a very long time for the game to feel complete, and then it was a lot of things like, oh well, the player should be gathering a lot less of this resource to allow for more brain space or whatever spent on everything else. I suppose the most interesting response to that is for the majority of the production, we played the game on the middle of the 3 difficulties, and then late on, we're like, let's actually start people on the easy version, easy and very, very strong sarcasm quotes, and then have you like progress further from that. And so that's probably the most straightforward answer to tuning.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that the answer of play it a lot and make adjustments is
Yeah.
a common
Yeah.
one.
I will say, if it helps anybody, it's very difficult for me to play, and it requires a lot of mental energy spent for us on the development side. So it's not like we're having a great time and everyone else is playing the hard game. It is hard for us as well.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much, Nick. That was wonderful. Thank you for coming,